We pick up in our third agricultural revolution by taking a look at how food is produced today. Today, one of the hallmarks of agriculture in the United States is known as commercial agriculture. Commercial agriculture carries with it a few distinctive characteristics. One is what's called vertical integration. This image on the right-hand side of the screen reflects vertical integration in the poultry industry. Many of you may be familiar with the eastern shore of Maryland, or the Delmarva Peninsula. The Delmarva Peninsula reflects a high level of vertical integration. While you drive through maybe Route 50 going out to the beach in Delaware or Maryland, you'll see cornfields, you'll see chicken grow houses, you'll see what appears to be these small rural independent farms. With vertical integration, what we're seeing is that all of these different basically sites of production are related. The cornfields produce excess corn to feed our chickens. Our chickens, from the hatcheries to the grow houses to the processing centers, are all part of this vertically integrated system. With vertical integration, we see high levels of specialization in monoculture. So we see where these different farms are hired out by big companies like Purdue or Tyson's to grow a single product. Within this commercial agriculture system, we see very intensive forms of agriculture, meaning that we have thousands of chickens on just a few acres in these different grow houses. These factory farms have become more and more prevalent, not only with chickens but also with livestock. And you can see inside one of these chicken grow houses today. There are some increasing concerns with this type of agriculture, as there are animal right concerns with packing animals in and basically just growing them for meat, and two, the spread of disease. When chickens and chicken waste or manure are collected like this, we have a higher risk of this type of toxic element entering our food system. And here you can see this runoff is used to collect chicken waste that's produced in these grow houses, and what farmers don't want, what basically our governments don't want, is that waste getting into our food supply and our water supply. Within commercial agriculture, we also see extensive farming, which means that we have large livestock farms where it's a little more spread out. So we do have this very advanced integrated form of farming in the United States today, and it's all part of what's called commercial agriculture. Another key element of commercial agriculture is that we are not growing to feed our families and our immediate communities, we're growing to feed a large population. In the United States today, the average farmer feeds over 150 people. A social concern with commercial agriculture is what's known as a dual society, in that the owners of agriculture are becoming increasingly separated from the actual production. So migrant labor, low-cost labor is essential for this type of agriculture to succeed. And what we're finding is that this social and economic disconnect continues to widen between the owners of production and those that are actually producing. In the developing world, what we have is the persistence of what's called subsistence agriculture. And this is where our farmers produce on small plots of land, and generally what you'll find is diverse forms of agriculture. So you'll find cows for dairy, cows for meat. You'll also see a range of products produced on an acre of land. So you might grow millet and corn and beans, squash, all on one small plot of land. So subsistence agriculture reflects more traditional forms of farming, and within this type of agriculture, again, your main audience or your main consumer is your family and your close community. So we're not producing for thousands or millions of people. This type of agriculture is very intensive, meaning we have a high level of output per unit of land. And you can see some of the terracing techniques that take place in Southeast Asia to modify your farming to reflect the different terrain in that area. So with this type of farming, we don't see the high level of technology, we don't see the high level of advanced irrigation. We see different techniques that have been adopted over centuries to make sure that the food supply meets the local demand. Around here, we're seeing an increased use of urban farming. We're seeing an increased use of buy local. So in the 21st century, we've seen the increase in local farmers producing, the increase in farmers markets. So we have seen some increase in subsistence agriculture in the United States, but again, our primary form of agriculture remains commercial. How do we feed the most people in the most efficient way? Part 2 of our lecture looks at globalization, and the highlight, or the key to globalization, agriculture, and our food supply is known as the supermarket revolution. I often ask people, where do you get your food? And the simple answer is the supermarket, right? And that's not really our food source, but that's where we purchase it. Supermarkets have completely revolutionized the way we consume, the way we eat, what is available. Supermarkets reflect a global supply chain. There is this idea of the 3,000-mile Caesar salad. So the next time you buy a salad or purchase the ingredients for a salad, look at the label, see where everything comes from. You'll notice that our veggies come from one part of the world, our almonds come from another. Perhaps if you put blue cheese on, where's that cheese or product, that dairy product sourced? So our supermarkets have created this intense supply chain, the supply chain that reflects production, reflects climates, reflects populations in all different parts of the world. The benefits of the supermarket revolution is that we are able to supply nutritious foods, a surplus of foods, at incredibly low prices. While nobody's saying, the cost of food is insignificant, the supply chain provides us with access to different parts of the world. Consider low prices. Well, $3 for an organic pepper might seem like a lot. Think about the trail, the path that pepper took from site of production to your grocery shelf, and think about how really complex this supply chain is and how efficient this supply chain is. So while we often have times of extended cold spells, extended droughts in this part of the country, we could go to the grocery store and we could basically get whatever we want whenever we want. Some of the concerns with the supermarket revolution include local agriculture. So as our supply chain extends out over 3,000 miles for some products, 10,000 miles for others, we see that local agriculture needs to change its mode of operation, needs to change its production in order to reflect local demand. So sometimes our local agriculture is at odds with our local retail. In developing countries, really over the last 30 years or so, we've seen an uptick in supermarkets. So supermarkets, something so ubiquitous, so common in our day-to-day life, are really a way to improve food access around the world. So the adoption of these North American supermarket models are now starting to penetrate South America, East Asia, Southeast Asia. And with this penetration, with this market penetration, we're seeing the efficient and nutritious ability to feed rapidly growing populations. You'll recall from several minutes ago, we looked at that chart as to where our populations are growing the fastest, and we looked at different parts of East and Southeast Asia. And South Asia is particularly spots of rapid population growth. So our supermarket revolution, again, while something very ubiquitous for most of us, very common for most of us, the presence of a supermarket and what it provides, if we take a step back, we could better examine the social and economic benefits of introducing a supermarket into a population. We're going to wrap up part 3 of this lecture by focusing on food supply. So while our food production exceeds our actual global demand, we see that there's still areas of hunger around the world. And when we look at our food supply, we have to ask ourselves, with hunger, is it a supply issue or is it an access issue? And this comes down to food security. When we look around the world today, out of the 7.5+ billion people, about 1 billion are undernourished, meaning they're not getting enough calories. Another billion are what's referred to as malnourished, meaning that they're getting their caloric intake, but the calories are not coming from nutritious foods. They're coming from foods that are high in sugar, high in saturated fats. They're not meeting really what a person needs to lead a healthy life. So when we look at supply and demand, we call it effective supply and demand. Are we effectively matching our demand with nutritious foods? We'll take a look at a couple examples of famine and see how power in the food system play out, where the food might be available, it might be on hand, but a power dynamic, a power structure is in play that limits a certain part of the population from accessing food. So when we look at hunger around the world, the first thing we need to ask ourselves is this an issue of access, or is this an issue of food supply? And we'll wrap up by looking at food deserts, and there's a linked TED Talk that focuses on food deserts in one North American city. Our first example of a food supply issue comes about 200 years ago. In 1815, Mount Tambora, which is located in the country of Indonesia, erupted. This was a massive stratovolcano. This eruption sent so much debris, so much ash and pollution, pyroclastic material into our atmosphere that the following year actually experienced a temperature drop. There was so much pollution in the atmosphere that it blocked much of the sun's energy from reaching the surface, warming up our climate, warming up our regions, and also providing for a growing season. So these lower temperatures led to crop failures around the world. In 1815, we didn't have the global supply chain network that we have today. So some of those areas in low latitudes closer to the equator that did experience a decent harvest, we weren't able to connect the food production in those areas with our markets in places like North America and Western Europe. As a result, the local crop failures in places like New England and places in the British Isles led to mass starvation and about 70,000 global deaths. So this natural event, this volcanic eruption, again, pushed so much pollution into the atmosphere that it actually cooled the Earth's temperature, creating a shortened growing season, crop failures, limited food production. Our second look is in Ireland in 1848. Earlier this semester, we looked at the Irish diaspora as a result of the potato famine. Now, the potato famine was really a big concern for a large part of the population. But when we take a deeper look, we see that this potato famine was really more of a social issue as it pertained to starvation. So Ireland was part of the English Empire, part of the British Empire in the 1800s. And the British owned the land, and they allowed the Irish population to farm on small plots. These tenant farmers were producing food for the English Empire. So they were growing diverse crops, but these crops were exported. The only thing that the Irish population was allowed to eat was the locally produced potatoes. So when an infection spread through the potato crop, the other food that was produced was continuing to be exported while the Irish population was starving because their staple crop was failing. So as a result of this, we saw the diaspora, the mass exodus of hundreds of thousands of Irish leaving Ireland and going to other parts of the world. So this famine, this mass starvation, was socially created. While the potato blight did in fact happen, what we saw was that the Irish population had limited access to the food being produced on Ireland, on the island. So during this time, we see a very strong example of a social restriction.